Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Carolyn Freund, Dean of the School of Global Policy and Strategy. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event hosted by the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy, also known as CCD. Given the ongoing trade conflict and recent global supply chain disruptions, CCD's goal of advancing global economic cooperation is more important than ever. The center produces rigorous academic research on current debates and brings together policymakers, business leaders, and top academic scholars to identify long-term solutions. It has grown to a team of 50 researchers, affiliated researchers, postdoctoral fellows, and senior advisors. CCD's research and discussions are yielding practical policy recommendations for government and business leaders on a wide range of topics important for global economic cooperation, including global supply chains, climate change, workforce development, policy uncertainty, and the design of institutions that underpin multilateralism. The center is now collaborating to create a WTO disputes data hub to serve as the go-to source for comprehensive and verified information on trade disputes adjudicated by the WTO. A more complete understanding of how, when, and why trade disputes arise and what happens in the process will improve our ability to design policies to resolve them. I'm incredibly proud of the Climate and Trade Task Force that was established by the center last year, and its report launched at the 26th UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow on November 9th. The task force report provided much needed insight that climate cooperation is impossible without trade coordination. Events like today's conference on the future of the global trading system, trade and labor markets, or like last fall's conference on the USMCA and global supply chains have brought together academia, industry, and government to explore innovative policy solutions. We are very honored today to host the Global Leaders Forum's keynote speaker, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Director General of the World Trade Organization. There will be a more detailed introduction of Dr. Ngozi by CCD's director, but I would like to say that what she's best known for in Washington during her long tenure at the World Bank and in the Nigerian government is getting things done. And I can't think of what we need more than that now at the WTO. I very much look forward to the discussion at today's event. I'll now turn to the director of the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy, Professor and Pastor Faculty Fellow Renee Bowen, to moderate today's discussion. Professor Bowen's an ideal moderator as her research focuses on designing an international economic order, considering institutional and political constraints. Renee, over to you.
Carolyn, thank you so much for those warm opening remarks. The School of Global Policy and Strategy at UCSD is very fortunate to have you taking the helm at GPS, and we're just really excited. You also have a lot of experience at the World Bank, and so it's quite fitting for you to introduce Dr. Okonjo-Iweala this morning. Dean Freund's support of CCD is inspiring, and it motivates us to keep pursuing our mission to advance global economic cooperation. And as Carolyn has said, as we see events around the world, it reminds us that cooperation is more needed than ever. I'm proud to say that this is CCD's third year of existence, and today we host our 6th Global Leaders Forum. Past forum guests included former U.S. Secretary of State, Dr. Condoleezza Rice, former World Bank President, Bob Zoellick, and the Prime Minister of Jamaica, the Honorable Andrew Holness. Before getting into the program, just a tiny bit of housekeeping. After this introduction, our guest will present some opening remarks, after which we will begin the hosted Q&A period. For the last 10 to 15 minutes of the session, we'll take questions from members of the audience, and you'll post that in the webinar Q&A. Please feel free to drop your questions in at any time to get yourself in the queue. I would like to take a moment right now to recognize my brilliant GPS student co-host, Karuna Kumar. Karuna will soon graduate with a master's degree in international affairs and public policy from GPS. She's a former journalist who most recently was the digital editor of Mint at the Wall Street Journal. She has extensive experience in global public policy, having worked for the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, for over a decade. She's worked with some of the biggest corporate brands, including Nestle, with their social responsibility strategy. And befitting today's topic, Karuna has experienced work on policy aimed at addressing disruptions in labor markets and how to make the future of work work. We are proud to have Karuna as a student at GPS, and I'm delighted to share hosting duties with her today. It's my great honor to introduce today's special guest, the 7th Director General of the World Trade Organization and the first woman and first African in that role, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. So before I go on, I will say that about a year ago when she was appointed, I had my 12-year-old daughter and 14-year-old son practice saying her name so that I would get it right. So I hope I have gotten it right. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala will speak today about the role of the World Trade Organization in ensuring trade works for all. As you might expect, she has an unbelievably long list of accolades, and I'll just mention a few in a moment. But near and dear to my heart, I think, is her most impressive of these, her 4 children and 3 grandchildren. While being supermom, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala has held many side jobs, including, as Carolyn mentioned, Nigeria's finance minister, foreign minister, and she's had a 25 career at the World Bank as a development economist. She was formerly chair of the board of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, which has immunized 760 million children globally. She was also recently appointed as the African Union Special Envoy to mobilize international financial support to fight COVID-19. She served on the boards of Standard Chartered, Twitter, just to mention a few things she's done. She's been listed as one of the 50 greatest world leaders by Fortune, the top 100 most influential people in the world by Time, the top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine, and the top 100 most powerful women in the world by Forbes, just to name a few of the esteemed lists she's been attached to. She's an undergraduate degree in economics from Harvard and a PhD in economics from MIT, my alma mater. She's a firm believer in the power of trade to help countries achieve robust economic growth and that a strong multilateral trading system is in the interest of all countries, as I do. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Director General of the World Trade Organization. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Professor Bowen, Dean Freund. Thank you all for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you. But I must say, when I listen to this list of accolades, I start looking around for who is this all about? It doesn't seem to be about me. But anyway, it's wonderful to be with you. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, well, while this is not quite the same as being in San Diego, which is absolutely beautiful and I'm sure warm at this time, I'm delighted to join you today to talk about trade and how it affects people. Trade is an important part of the solutions we need for the challenges of our time, from pandemic response and preparedness to decarbonizing our economies and dealing with inequality. But trade will not be able to realize its full potential to serve these ends if large numbers of people see in it a threat more than an opportunity. And that's why it's so important to make sure that trade works for everyone. The broad case I want to make to you today is that trade has been enormously beneficial for productivity, purchasing power, and poverty reduction. But there are people and countries that have not shared adequately in the benefits and have been left behind. In the 30 to 40 years before the COVID-19 pandemic, global trade was turbocharged by a series of developments. Governments everywhere, most dramatically in China, India, and Eastern Europe, embraced market-oriented policies, lowered trade barriers, and opened their markets to foreign investment. The World Trade Organization, which emerged from the Uruguay round, of multilateral trade negotiations from 1986 to 1994 made market access more stable and predictable. China joined the WTO in 2001, and many Eastern European countries acceded to both the European Union and the WTO. On the positive side, trade and open global markets helped lift over 1 billion people out of poverty, most dramatically in China. In 1980, close to 40% of the world population lived on less than the equivalent of $1.90 a day. By 2019, pre-pandemic, it was less than 10%, making it possible for us to imagine the end of extreme poverty. In the 25 years before COVID-19, faster growth in the developing world meant that poorer countries started to narrow the income gap with richer ones for the first time since the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago, according to a 2021 paper by Dev Patel et al. Not coincidentally, this overlapped with the WTO's first quarter century. The gains in advanced economies may be less eye-popping, but they are also real. Open trade has led to wider choices and lower prices for many goods and services, which translates into a real boost to purchasing power. By one estimate, for low-income families in advanced economies, trade has cut the price of the household consumption basket by 2/3. According to the US Census Bureau, the Consumer Price Index for durable goods fell steadily for 25 years before starting to pick up again in 2021. Money saved on consumer durables created jobs for people at local restaurants, cultural venues, and gyms. In fact, part of the supply chain problems we are currently seeing is that the pandemic has shifted spending away from in-person services and towards consumer durables. In both rich and poor countries, trade has been a key means to diffuse green technologies whilst reducing their costs, though there is plenty more governments can do to lower trade barriers to environmental goods and services on the road to net zero. And during the pandemic, we have seen trade be a vital lifeline for access to food and medical supplies and for producing and distributing COVID-19 vaccines. And the WTO has been quite active on this on the supply chain side, and I'm very proud of that. Now let's look at the negative side of the ledger. Within the developing world, the very poorest people were locked out of the games. The economist Branko Milanovic, a former colleague at the World Bank, estimates that between 1988 and 2008, the world's poorest 5 to 10% of people saw little income growth, even as the next 60% or so of the global population registered historically strong income gains. For several developing and least developed countries, economic convergence had been very modest before the pandemic. And of course, with COVID-19, divergence is now the story. Even as global value chains expanded their reach to places like Vietnam, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Morocco, many countries remain marginalized, supplying raw materials, if anything. In many rich countries, meanwhile, trade has been blamed for job losses, prolonged wage stagnation, and rising inequality. We should recognize that trade is an easy scapegoat for political anger. The goods and services foreigners produce are tangible, as are the jobs they allegedly take. Meanwhile, machines and software or changing consumer preferences they are not so well noticed. That said, there has been a real challenge from the integration of China and other regions into global manufacturing production. To help us think through the effects of trade and the appropriate policy responses, I want to make 3 points. First, whilst trade has caused some job losses, the bigger culprits are elsewhere, notably technology. In a series of papers, David Otter, David Dunn, and Gordon Hanson, the last of whom was at UC San Diego for much of the research period, have shown that exposure to Chinese imports can explain 26% of the manufacturing job losses in the US from 2000 to 2007. This corresponds to almost 1 million jobs, 982,000 jobs. And the job losses were often concentrated in places where certain industrial sectors had clustered, leading to prolonged localized depressions. But their estimates still mean that 3/4, 74% of the lost jobs were due to other forces. Employment data suggests that manufacturing jobs are being lost just about everywhere, irrespective of whether countries are net importers or net exporters of goods. For instance, while Germany regularly runs a large trade surplus, the share of employment in industry fell from 34% to 27% between 2020 and 2019. In the US, over the same time period, the share fell from 24% to 20%. Even in China, the factory of the world, the share of employment in industry has been falling steadily since peaking at 30% in 2012, reaching 27% pre-pandemic as of 2019. This is primarily a productivity story. Thanks to automation, producing a given amount of goods requires many fewer workers. Productivity growth is slower in services where many kinds of work are harder to automate. And this sector has consequently expanded the share of total employment. This brings me to my second point about trade and jobs. While trade can help create jobs, particularly in developing countries where domestic demand is low, the effect of trade in large advanced economies like the US is often more about the composition of employment, increasing the number of higher quality jobs within the economy. So for instance, Finster and Sasahara find that between 1995 and 2011, trade added close to 1 million jobs to the US economy, mostly due to an increase in services exports, which involve highly skilled workers. In aggregate numbers, these jobs more or less offset the China-related job losses I mentioned earlier. The problem is the new jobs were not in the same places as the old jobs or going to the same people. Many of the people who lost jobs in the China shock ended up dropping out of the labor force, retiring early, or taking lower paid services work. The connection between trade and job quality is illustrated by recent US Census Bureau data, which shows that firms that export tend to create higher paying jobs, especially for women. It shows that exporting businesses employ on average 54 workers at a mean salary of $64,000. For non-exporting firms, the figures are 10 workers at an average salary of $41,000. Interestingly, the pay premium is highest for the 23,500 women-owned exporting businesses the census had data for. They averaged 38 workers at $61,000, as against 9 workers and $38,000 for non-exporting firms owned by women. My third point is that countries cannot afford to be complacent. Economic change is constant. National competitive advantages will change. Technology will evolve. Consumer preferences will shift. Governments need to help workers and places adjust and thrive amid these changes. Active labor market policies, social safety nets, minimum wage legislation, and other domestic institutional choices and policy choices make a huge difference here. For instance, Denmark spends 2.8% of its GDP on active labor market policies, helping displaced workers retrain and find new jobs. Japan and the United States do much less well, spending less than 1% of GDP on both active and passive labor market policies. Danish workers have much less reason to fear losing their jobs and much more reason to believe that they'll be able to share in the gains from trade or technological change. If ensuring trade works for all has a major domestic policy component, let me conclude by saying that there is also an important inclusion agenda in the trade arena, including at the WTO. The current disruptions in global supply chains offer an opportunity, in my view, for poor and marginalized countries, particularly in Africa, to enter the economic mainstream by attracting investment in manufacturing, services, and agriculture value chains. This is because as businesses try to manage the supply chain risks engendered by the pandemic, they are considering nearshoring and inventory accumulation more than reshoring. This is what our data at the WTO shows. Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and Ethiopia have already benefited from this diversification of manufacturing. So can other poor countries in what I would term a re-globalization. Re-globalization can also be a tool for socioeconomic inclusion, bringing marginalized people, marginalized countries, micro, small, and medium enterprises or MISMEs, and women-owned businesses into the mainstream. For both sets of goals, lowering the costs associated with trade is essential. The WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement took important steps in this direction, as did the Services Domestic Regulation Agreement concluded by 67 WTO members last December. Ongoing negotiations among large groups of WTO members offer the prospect of basic global standards for e-commerce and investment facilitation. Other groups of members are working to empower MISMEs and women-owned businesses to trade. Ladies and gentlemen, turning away from trade will not solve any of the problems we currently face. It would not help us produce the COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics we need. It would make it harder, not easier, for developing countries to make up the economic ground they have lost. It would lower future growth potential, even in the world's richest countries, and it would impede the fight against climate change. That's what's at stake here. If we don't make trade work for all of us, for people, there's a real risk it will end up working for none of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those wonderful remarks. I'm going to hand it over to Karuna for the first question.
Thank you, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala. It was a wonderful remarks that you made, and I'm really grateful and honored that you're spending this time with us today. So without further ado, let me sort of pose the first question to you, which leads on from the fact that you rightly mentioned world trade must work for everyone. So as we speak this morning, it is absolutely a tragedy to know that Russia continues a full-scale assault on Ukraine, killing hundreds of civilians as well as military soldiers. So as we recognize the need for global cooperation, I think it becomes also extremely necessary to acknowledge the consequences of the lack thereof. And world trade occupies an essential role in helping countries not only find common ground, but also a certain shared gains. So we cannot separate the issue of decent work and labor standards from international trade agreements. And we know that international economic agreements at the moment are heading towards tighter labor standards. So I would be curious to understand how you foresee the World Trade Organization's role in making trade actions and labor standards work together. Thank you.
Thank you. That is $1 million question, one of the tricky ones. And I'll tell you why. I have to answer it very carefully because the WTO is a 164-member driven organization. And we have different members at different ends of the spectrum on the issue of labor, not because they don't want decent labor standards, but because definitions of what constitutes decent forced labor or other types of labor that are not appropriate differ among countries. So there's a fear. So I just want you to understand why this may be a controversial thing. As a result, the WTO, I found, is very difficult to really talk about labor, but we're getting there. I just want to say that we've had our first agreement in which we've recognized the Services Domestic Regulation Agreement, in which we've explicitly brought in the recognition of women and their labor and services as being accorded equal opportunity as men, as one of the articles and clauses in the agreement. But coming back to that, it's clear that in FTAs, in bilateral agreements, in regional agreements, the issue of decent work and labor standards is becoming more and more the norm. And, that is also setting a kind of trailblazing path for us at the WTO. Sometimes it's the multilateral agreements that lead, and then the bilaterals copy. If you look at most of those agreements, they're really based on WTO standards. But in the case of labor, it's the other way. And I anticipate, in fact, we have in one agreement we're negotiating right now, the fisheries, harmful fisheries subsidies agreement that is ongoing and which I dream and hope will complete soon. One of the issues put forward by one of our members, the United States, is the need to avoid the use of forced labor. And this is something that the membership, as they negotiate, are debating. So my thought is that we have to be very clear with our developing country members who sometimes quite rightly may have trepidations about definitions of forced labor and child labor. And I can tell you, some of them say to me, culturally, in my country or in many African countries, for instance, you know, a child can leave their home to live with another relative and be trained working with them as something, as an apprentice in the home and going to school at the same time. And some people will say this is forced labor, but to us it's not. It's part of what we do interfamily to help people. Sometimes it's someone from the village who is not necessarily from your family. So there's a lot of debate. What if they start describing that as child labor or forced labor? That's why people are hesitant. And I was very curious to find when I was in the US that in the Midwest, 14-year-olds are given a driving license. And they're given a driving license because they have to help their parents drive tractors on the farm. But that is not seen as child labor, you know? But if a 14-year-old in a developing country is now working on a cocoa farm or something, somebody may say that's forced labor. So I just want to explain to you why cultural differences permeate in the way our members see this. And so that's why we must tread a little bit carefully. But I believe in decent work. I believe in labor standards, and eventually, that's my personal belief, I hasten to say, because there may be many of our members watching this. We just have to be careful how we approach it at the WTO.
Thank you, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala. Those are really insightful remarks on the cultural differences and how we define child labor versus forced labor. So, you know, one of the hotly discussed topics is forced labor in certain countries that appear to give unfair market advantage. And, you know, I will sort of bring up the elephant in the room, China. And I'm curious how the WTO sees itself sort of treading that difficult balance with, as you say, taking into account all its members' interests, while at the same time balancing this need to ensure trade is working for all. You know, I understand that's a really difficult problem, but any insight that you have there would be really helpful.
Well, I mean, again, this is at part of what we are debating now with respect to the fisheries subsidies. So it's a really live issue. And if you talk to China, they would say that, you know, in the case of fishery, their own law does not allow them to use forced labor to deliver. So they would dispute that. I just want to be clear on that. But it's a live thing. We know that there's use of forced labor in the world. We know there's also use of child labor. When I talk about being careful about child labor, there are some areas of child labor you can be very clear that this is not, this is different. If you see children working in mines nonstop, not going to school, clearly, you know, that's something you need to look at. So the forced labor issue in China, as well as in any other places, is a delicate one. I will see how we will crack this issue of forced labor in fisheries, and that could determine a way forward for us to deal with this issue. It's live in the world, so we can't pretend that it's not a factor. The issue is how do we approach it, but approach it we eventually will.
Great. So just a quick follow-up on that. I realize that the WTO essentially outsources, if you would, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's discussions of labor to the ILO. So at least I read this on the WTO's information. And I'm sort of curious if it's useful to have sort of at least a shared understanding or shared definitions of what forced labor means. And to the extent the WTO is taking a leadership in those shared definitions or really just outsourcing it to other organizations.
Well, thanks, Renee. I think outsourcing is a bit of a strong word. Here in Geneva, there are many United Nations organizations taking care of different things. And so members see the ILO as the right place to discuss labor issues. So it's not so much outsourcing it as saying, listen, we are about trade. We have an organization that deals with labor. And if there are issues of forced labor in a country or inappropriate practices, the ILO is fully equipped to deal with that. So that is the debate here, that members feel, why are we getting bogged down in this when we have a UN organization that deals with that, and it should be there. But of course, in this complicated world of polycrisis, things are not as simple as that. And so, there are crossovers. And I hope that we can find those definitions, as you say, that we can all accept, that will enable us to have a discourse on this matter in the organization, one that is not emotive, that takes account of all these cultural differences in how we define labor and tries to lay it down. Of course, the ILO will be of tremendous help. I've launched a study, a joint study with the ILO, looking at the impact of the pandemic on female labor during this time, gingerly, and it was not without controversy, but we are doing it and trying to explore ways and means that we can work with the ILO to the benefit of trade. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll hand it over to Karuna for the last prepared question, and then I'd love to take at least one or two questions from the audience. We may not get to too many given our time. Karuna, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, Professor Bowen. So Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, this is our last question, but I think it goes really well with the point that you just made about female labor force participation rate. So I think it's absolutely apt to end with this question. Now, as a woman and as a woman of color, I have to ask this of you, which is, you have a long-standing career and credence in the development sector. You have won multiple accolades. You have not only broken the glass ceiling, you've nearly shattered it. So what were some of the challenges you faced as a woman and as a woman of color moving up the ranks in a highly bureaucratic system, and how did you overcome it to be where you are today? Thank you.
Wow. That could take the whole day. I've actually written a book about some of this, which is recently published with Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia. It's called Women and Leadership, Real Lives, Real Lessons. And we were talking with each other on the side of conferences, and we noticed in spite of our vast cultural differences, as women leaders, we were having the same kind of experience. So we said, wow, why don't we try and put this down? And then we said, maybe we should talk to other women and see if they have those experiences. And we decided to interview 8 women leaders, from Jacinda Ardern to Hillary Clinton to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Joyce Banda, and you can look at the list of names, Christine Lagarde. And we had some hypotheses, but we found some common threads in what they experience. And when they experience it, in the book, I say, if this is what they experience for a woman of color, it's even more so. For instance, one of the common experiences, you won't believe this, I'll just name 2. One is the leaders found that if they're too soft if they speak too gently or they appear soft in the way they handle things, then they are termed as not being strong enough or competent enough. On the other hand, if they are very I don't know how to tell. They're very kind of strong in the way they deal with matters and approach matters and the way they speak. They are termed as being aggressive. So they spend the time trying to manage between these two. Am I too soft? Or am I too sounding too aggressive? These two ends, and trying to find a path. But the interesting thing is, at the end of the day, each one decided, I can't do this. I just have to be myself. And you can only lead by being yourself, not in trying to manage this or that or being someone else. So it's interesting, that challenge. And we have a chapter in the book called It's All About the Hair. It's a very fun book. And this is because Hillary Clinton told us she had calculated the number of hours she spent trying to get her hair done. And these were wasted hours because people were always commenting about her hair. But it led us to ask the women leaders, these prime ministers and presidents, what about appearance? And all of them, without a doubt. And I spoke to Angela Merkel recently, who just retired as chancellor, and she too had the same experience, found that when they entered as a leader, people were more looking at their appearance, what they were wearing, whether they were overweight or underweight or what it was, paying more attention, and media was not kind. They were writing more about that than about what they had to say. So how did we all deal with this? We all came to the same answer in different ways. For me, you see the way I dress. I love African clothes. I've always dressed like this. I evolved a style with my headdress. I don't have to worry about my hair because I have this headdress, thank God. And people know I'm going to appear like this. So they don't spend their time wondering what is Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala going to look like. They know it will only be the color of what I wear and the pattern that might change, but they know my look. So all these women said, I started wearing pantsuits. Angela Merkel told me, look, I just decided to wear this and just change the color of the jacket every day. But people now know when I appear, this is what I'm going to look like. So they no longer kind of think about my appearance. They focus on what I have to say. So these are some of the challenges. And if you're a woman of color, the challenge when you walk into a room is that people see your color and what you're wearing, but your color most of all before they see you, and they're already making judgments about whether you're up to the job or whether you're going to say something intelligent. And, I've had this challenge. So the thing is not to let it faze you. My father brought me up to say, if people think like that, it's their problem, not yours. So when I walk into a room, if you see that kind of look, for me, it's their problem. And I start focusing on what I have to say. But goodness, I've found that the minute you start talking and what you have to say makes sense and is substantive, people forget whether you're a woman, you're of color, you're not of color. So I always tell women, if you're going to do something, be very clear on your subject. Know what you're talking about. And people will forget whatever it is they're dealing with. Color or no color, clothes or no clothes. Sorry, this is a very long answer, but you asked. And these are only just two things that from the book. So I'm not trying to sell the book, but you can go and read it.
I think I will. Thank you so much. I absolutely need to read that book. And I love that you said it's all about the hair. I recently had that discussion with my husband about the difference between his hair, which is pretty much non-existent, and how much time I have to spend on mine. And I love your suggestion to essentially keep a uniform, which, by the way, my husband does. So now I will take a page out of his book and remember the uniform.
Renee, can I just make a joke? I don't
Yes.
think people spend time commenting too much on Prime Minister Boris Johnson's hair. But I bet you that if a woman had that hairstyle, it would attract no end of comments and distract from what the woman leader has to say.
I pretty much agree with that. I will say that it's quite notable. We have 4 incredible women on this webinar this morning. I'm really delighted, and that was not intentional. So somehow we've managed to make it. So I'll turn over the last few minutes to questions from the audience. We have quite a few, so I'll try to summarize a few. There's some on Africa. We didn't get to touch on Africa in the global economy, even though you mentioned that in your remarks. So I'd love to hear some of your vision for Africa in the global economy, how Africa interacts with the WTO, and thoughts that you have there. How can the relationship, for example, between the US and Africa be a catalyst for restoring globalization, or reglobalization, as you termed it? I really like that term.
Well, thank you. I just was talking this morning about African trade, and one of the reasons I took this job is because I feel excited about the potential of trade to help be part of the solution to all these things. When you talk to people, they usually don't have that great opinion about trade or the WTO. People don't know what the WTO is. And I said, we have to work hard to make sure that the ordinary man and woman on the street, even in my village, know what WTO is about. Because our charter, our purpose in the Marrakesh Agreement, believe it or not, is to help enhance living standards, create employment, and support sustainable development. It's all about people. So the issue here is, how can we at WTO, and how do we work with Africa? What this pandemic has done is set Africa back. It's wiped about 1.5 decades of development. Prior to the pandemic, it wasn't perfect, but the continent was growing at a reasonable pace. And 8 of the 10 fastest growing countries in the world pre-pandemic were African countries, countries like Rwanda, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and so on. But with this pandemic, the continent has been set back, and the divergence between the way it's recovering and the way the developed countries are recovering is vast, both in terms of trade rebound as well as GDP growth. But Africa has enormous, exciting potential. And I'll tell you, with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that has just been put in place by the continent, it's the largest free trade agreement in terms of number of countries, 55 countries in the world, with a population, a market of 1.3 to 1.4 billion people. So my vision with this is that this could really be the springboard, for Africa to trade more with itself and trade its way to prosperity and trade with the outside world. Right now, Africa's share of world trade, pre-pandemic, it was 3% and had stagnated for a while, very low. Now it's about 2.4%, so it has decreased. Africa's trade with itself, intra-African trade, is 15%. Trades more with the outside than. But we found that the Economic Commission for Africa, UN Economic Commission, did some work and found that when Africa trades with itself, it's more of manufactured goods, which is more job creating. When it trades with the outside, it is more of raw materials and commodities. So that means that if Africa could trade more with itself and continue along this path, it would be able to create more jobs for the youth. Burgeoning youth on the continent. The median age in my country is 18, and in many African countries, whilst the developed countries are aging. So we have to create jobs for the youth. So my vision is, how do we use trade? How can WTO support and work with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement in order to make sure that African countries benefit from this? So this is one of the things that I'm passionate about. And I was just talking of one industry. I'll just illustrate to you. Right now, we're in the pandemic. And one of the things we've been pushing from the WTO end is working with the top 10 CEOs of vaccine manufacturers in the world to try to help them. We monitor supply chains. We have a monitoring and transparency function. So it's all about their supply chains. Where are there export restrictions and prohibitions? Where are there other impediments? And in working with them, encourage them to decentralize production to developing countries, including in Africa. Why should Africa import 90% of its pharmaceuticals and 99% of its vaccines? So now we have this thing where with WHO and all, there is a possibility of establishing a vaccine manufacturing industry, which could lead to a whole big pharmaceutical industry on the continent, an ecosystem for pharmaceutics. So this is exciting, it's happening, it's doable. And this is one of the ways we can make Africa benefit from what's happening in the global economy.
Yeah, that's really exciting. Here at GPS, we have and UCSD generally, we have a lot of economists focused on Africa and looking at the growth in the population of young people in Africa, and observing that global economic growth is really going to be driven by the African continent going forward. So thank you for those remarks. In the very last really 3 minutes, I wish I could get to all questions, but I will read 2 questions, one from Jennifer Hillman and one from Don Rosenberg. Jennifer Hillman, you may be familiar with, was an appellate body judge at the WTO. She says, with congratulations to Dr. Okonjo-Iweala on getting the WTO ministerial meeting scheduled and all of the work to make it a success. My question is on the forces drawing political will, market access demands, and negotiation resources away from the WTO, which is the rise of regionalism and regional agreements. Do you think the WTO has an appropriate relationship with regional agreements? Should more be done to bring regional agreements under the WTO umbrella? Are you concerned that RCEP, CPTPP, Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, USMCA, and now, of course, the IPEF that's being discussed, will get the attention and the engagement of business labor groups that is needed at the WTO to get a robust agenda pushed over the finish line at the June ministerial? And a related question from Don, much shorter, are you optimistic about the future of the appellate body? And you have 2 minutes.
I have 2 minutes. Well, this is impossible. Okay, short. I'm not worried about regional or bilateral trade agreements. It's interesting. 75% of world trade is still occurring on WTO terms. So the multilateral trading system is still operative. 22% of world trade is on terms of the bilaterals and regional agreements. So they are all built on WTO principles. And so I think our job is to try and support them and learn from them, because sometimes they are more cutting edge than what we're doing, and they can learn from us. So that's the way I see them, that it's a collaboration, it's a support, it's not a threat. So that's a quick one to that. And I could go on and on, but I can't. On the appellate body, am I optimistic? Let's put it this way. It's been very difficult to talk about reforming the dispute settlement system or mechanism and the appellate body, which is paralyzed, because the US has not been ready to engage on it for some time. But I have to say that recently, with the coming in of the new USTR, Catherine Tai, she's been, took a little time to reflect, but she's been coming and they're willing to engage, and we're all quite happy about that. It's not going to be fast because there are differences in the way members see the dispute settlement system and the appellate body. There are some who want to restore the appellate body to the way it is. The US has, or maybe not to the way it is, but something close, a 2-tier system. the US has other ideas and has legitimate concerns about the way it was functioning before. I think Catherine Tai also made a good point that I share. It was supposed to be a dispute settlement mechanism of last resort. In other words, there are other means, arbitration, mediation, and so on. You're supposed to try before taking things there. But all those other means are not as used as they should be. And we should think of a basket of tools approach to dispute settlement at the WTO. And it's happening now. Some countries are seeking mediated things. The US has been working with the EU to solve their problems. So grosso modo, in short, I see a reform. It's going to take time because not everybody agrees on the nature of the reform, but we hope we can kick off the mechanism and process to do it at the ministerial on June 13th. Thank you, which is my birthday.
Oh, wonderful. A birthday present. Thank you so much for the time you've spent with us this morning, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala. This has been so refreshing. I wish we could spend much more time with you, but I do know that you have many things to do. Please feel free to come by UCSD in San Diego sometime. Thank you very much. I'm going to close out the session now.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.